Mr. President, I'd like to speak about the Fisher Amendment that we're slated to vote on at some point around here. And while I respect my neighbor from Nebraska, where she's coming from with this effort, the proposal unfortunately misses the mark by a mile. The amendment would set up new and unprecedented process for protective land designations. It says the Secretary of Interior or Agriculture has to publish in the Federal Register 2 findings before any congressional protections on public lands would go into effect. First, the Secretary has to find that new protected land would not adversely affect our efforts to administer existing protected land. And then second, the Department has to have sufficient resources, whatever that is, to implement plans for existing protected land. While perhaps innocuous sounding, these would be huge changes in how we do business around here. Coming from a state that's over 1/3 federal land, I prefer that drastic reform proposals like this at least have the benefit of a committee hearing before we vote on them on the floor. That way we can hear expert testimony as to whether this is a good idea or learn about ways we might be able to improve the measure. But as far as I know, this language hasn't had a hearing in this Congress or any other Congress for that matter. Proponents of this amendment are going to argue that it simply ensures that our land agencies can afford to keep up with the maintenance of new protected lands. And listen, I'm the first and have been on this floor year after year after year talking about the fiscal condition of this country. I'm the first to believe we need more fiscal discipline around here, but this is not the way we should get it. I'm also a huge believer that we shouldn't be overburdening these agencies, and we shouldn't be overregulating through them either. But unfortunately, this amendment takes a hatchet where the absolute most that's needed, if anything, is a surgical fix. In fact, under this amendment, opponents of protected lands could reduce funding for our land agencies through the appropriations process and then turn around and say the Secretary's got to veto the new proposals because sufficient resources aren't available. As one of my friends from Colorado said in the paper this morning, quote, "This amendment would be a 1-2 punch. First, starve conservation agencies of needed funding, and then block any new protections as a result." Mr. President, this amendment is drafted in a way that it leaves huge discretion to a future secretary to approve or veto protections that Congress has seen fit to create. If the amendment passed, nothing would stop a future secretary from finding that every single conservation bill that this Congress has passed should not take effect, all because he or she failed to publish the vague set of findings laid out in this proposal. Historically, we don't let a member of the executive branch any discretion as to whether they implement the laws that Congress passes and that the president has signed. Yet this measure would do just that. I think keeping that historical precedent where the legislative branch makes the laws and the executive branch implements them is important. We've heard a lot about that on this floor recently, particularly in a case like this where we're talking about our national heritage. Coloradans and all Americans love their public lands and want to see more done to protect them. And instead, this amendment creates new layers of red tape and makes enacting protective designations even more difficult than it has been. Once again, Mr. President, I want to say on this floor, I appreciate the senator from Nebraska's effort here, and I'd be happy to work with her to address some of her concerns. But I'd argue that the investments we do make in our public lands are worthwhile ones. And I would invite anybody in this chamber to come to Colorado and see what I'm talking about. Protected lands and wide open spaces are a huge driver of economic growth all across our country. They help sustain a $600 billion outdoor recreation economy. A lot of those businesses, for obvious reasons, are headquartered in Colorado. On top of the economic benefits, wilderness areas, national monuments, national parks are a fundamental part of the fabric of our country and of our country's history. It's important to preserve these lands for our kids and our grandkids, just as our grandparents preserved them for us. And it's worth investing some money to do that, so the next generation and the one after that can experience the greatness that all Americans feel when they first visit the Grand Canyon, or Rocky Mountain National Park, or Chimney Rock National Monument, or the Everglades, or wherever we find the next beautiful or historically significant area that Congress or the President decides to protect. This discussion is actually a timely one because just this past December, we passed a large package of conservation measures into law on a bipartisan basis. That package included a bill that we worked on in Colorado called the Hermosa Creek Watershed Protection Act. Let me say at the outset that our office may have introduced that bill in Congress, but it was really the people I represent in Southwest Colorado who wrote that bill. This legislation grew from the grassroots up from day one, Republicans, Democrats, independents working together to cement a long-term plan for their community's future. Not only was it bipartisan at the local level, but also in Congress. My friend Scott Tipton championed the bill on the House side. The Hermosa Creek watershed deserved to be protected. That's why the community came together to keep it just as it was. That was the plan of the community. And that's what our bill finally accomplished at the end of the last Congress. However, if we were to pass the amendment in front of us today, all the hard work that went into passing the Hermosa bill could be undone by the Interior Secretary. Every single meeting had in Southwest Colorado, every single conversation that led to the improvement of this legislation, all of that could be gone in an instant. Not because the Congress undoes the law, but because some administrator using their fiat is able to undo the law. And it's unlikely, Mr. President, I can't say this for sure, but it's unlikely that that person is going to have any idea what's in the Hermosa Creek bill or any of the other bills that we've worked on and passed. And that's just simply not how we do business around here, and there's a good reason for that. And I am compelled, therefore, to urge other senators in this body to please oppose the Fisher Amendment so we can avoid such a scenario. Rejecting the amendment will preserve our conservation legacy, a legacy that goes straight back to President Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican who signed the Antiquities Act into law in 1906 and includes the formal establishment of the National Park System almost 100 years ago. Mr. President, this is an extraordinarily beautiful country that we all have the privilege to represent. We ought to encourage conservation efforts, not make them harder to achieve. We ought to build on the legacy of generations of Americans and generations in this body of Republicans and Democrats working together to preserve our natural heritage. I will therefore oppose the Fisher Amendment when it comes up for a vote, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum.